The war did not begin with hatred, but with manners and protocols and long speeches, delivered by calm envoys from distant coalitions, who believed that conflict could be contained by rules and clean lines on star charts. Humanity listened with the patience of a young species, eager to belong, and agreed to the codes of civilized battle that promised limited targets, limited weapons, and limited suffering. For a while, the galaxy applauded Earth for its restraint. Cities burned on other worlds, while Earth held back, choosing symbolic losses and tidy retreats and carefully measured responses. The councils praised humanity as responsible and modern and worthy of trade. Agreements and cautious alliances. Then came the carnage on the moon of Lysa, where a demonstration strike approved by every charter shattered habitats filled with workers who were classified as acceptable losses. The reports were precise and bloodless, yet the numbers kept rising, and the images leaked, and the silence. On Earth grew heavy. Leaders met in quiet rooms and watched the feeds and listened to analysts explain how the rules had been followed perfectly, how the enemy had acted within bounds, how apologies were already being drafted. Humanity learned then that civilized battles were not gentle. They were merely sanitized on Earth. The people did not riot. They remembered older lessons carved into history with harder tools. They remembered that rules written by the powerful often serve the powerful. They waited and watched as the councils offered compensation and condolences and a promise of future compliance. A man named Elias stood on a cliff above a gray sea and listened to the wind. He was not a general or a politician. He had once been an engineer and then a logistics planner, and now he served as a coordinator in the quiet backbone of defense. He understood systems and thresholds and failure modes. He knew when a structure could not bear more stress. In orbit, shipyards hummed with activity that was carefully misnamed as maintenance and upgrades. Nothing in the charters forbade preparation. After all, civilized wars assumed mutual restraint, and preparation was considered prudent across Earth. Networks filled with debates that were fierce but focused. There was grief, but also clarity. The question was not whether to respond, but how. The old ways promised balance and respect and endless meetings. The memory of Lysa promised something else. When the next council session convened, Earth requested the floor. The chamber expected another measured address, another appeal to norms and enforcement. Instead, a simple statement arrived, transmitted and clear. Language without ornament. Earth would no longer participate in civilized battles. Chamber erupted with confusion and procedural objections and demands for clarification. Earth continued speaking and explained that the rules had become tools that transformed massacre into compliance. Humanity would defend itself and its allies without adherence to codes that permitted atrocity through paperwork. Some delegates threatened sanctions, others warned of isolation. A few quietly listened. In the weeks that followed, Earth fleets moved with unsettling purpose. They did not announce targets or timetables. They did not strike civilian centers, nor did they seek spectacle. They focused on infrastructure that enabled slaughter supply hubs, command relays, and economic arteries that fed war machines. The difference was not brutality, but honesty. There were no symbolic losses, no tidy engagements, no theatrical retreats. When resistance appeared, it was met decisively and then bypassed. Humanity refused the rhythm of ritualized war and instead treated conflict as a problem to be ended. The frontier world of Terra, an allied colony, waited behind brittle shields, expecting a demonstration strike like the one that had destroyed Lysa. Instead, Earth vessels arrived silently and disabled the attackers before weapons could be powered. The battle never happened. The threat ended without a headline. Observers struggled to categorize the new approach. It did not fit doctrines or legal frameworks. It was too fast, too comprehensive. Too final. Analysts noted a strange pattern. Casualty numbers dropped across multiple regions as wars lost their momentum. When their engines failed, a woman named Mira served as a liaison to humanitarian convoys. She saw the change from the ground. With routes secured and sieges broken, aid flowed again. Children returned to schools that had been closed for years. The absence of declared battles felt like peace, even though the galaxy had not agreed to call it that. Opponents accused Earth of hypocrisy and escalation, Earth answered with transparency, sharing evidence of every action and its purpose. There were no claims of moral superiority, only a refusal to pretend that cruelty could be civilized as months turned to years' conflicts. Across known space shifted some factions laid down arms when their sponsors could no longer sustain them. Others attempted to adapt and found that systems designed for rule-bound wars collapsed under pressure that ignored ceremonies. Elias watched the data and felt a quiet sorrow for what had been lost and a cautious hope for what had been gained. He knew that humanity had crossed a line not into savagery but into responsibility. Without the shelter of polite fiction, every choice carried its true weight. At a final council session, Earth presented a proposal, not a treaty of limits, but a framework for prevention, shared monitoring, rapid intervention, and accountability that measured outcomes, not intentions. It offered help to build resilience and to dismantle incentives for mass harm. Some rejected it outright, others hesitated, then a few agreed, and the few became many. The phrase "no more civilized battles" spread across channels and classrooms. It was misunderstood by some as a call to chaos, yet those who lived through the change understood its meaning. Civilization was not about how wars were fought, but about whether they were allowed to consume the innocent. In time, the councils rewrote their charters, the language grew plainer, the exceptions shrank. The universe did not become gentle, but it became less tolerant of excuses on Earth. Memorials were built, not to victories, but to restraint, earned through resolve. Names were etched of places saved rather than enemies defeated. Children learned that strength was not proven by how cleanly one could destroy, but by how firmly one could refuse a lie. Looking out at the stars, humanity accepted that it would always be judged. Some would fear its methods, others would seek its partnership. Humanity did not demand praise, it simply held to its answer to the carnage and moved forward with eyes open and hands steady. The shift unsettled commanders who had built careers on the theater of restraint. They were experts at calibrating losses and staging withdrawals. And speaking in language that dulled pain, Earth's refusal removed their stage and exposed the emptiness beneath. Many resigned. Some adapted and found themselves working on evacuation planning and reconstruction. Instead, trade lanes reopened under joint patrols that focused on deterrence through certainty rather than display. Pirates learned that there would be no chase scenes, no warnings fired into empty space, only swift disabling and fair trials overseen by mixed courts. The myth of glamour faded, and with it recruitment. A teacher named Rowan on a dust world far from Earth noticed how curricula changed history. Lessons no longer framed wars as contests of honor, but as failures of imagination. Students were asked to map supply chains and social pressures, and to propose ways to interrupt cycles before weapons were chosen. They debated fiercely, yet grounded their arguments in lives rather than flags. Not every encounter ended cleanly. On the rim, a warlord attempted to bait Earth into a spectacle by threatening hostages. The response was quiet negotiations paired with unseen preparation. When the moment came, the captives were extracted, and the warlord found himself isolated by his own lieutenants whose resources had vanished. Overnight, the galaxy learned that drama no longer worked. Critics persisted, and some were sincere. They asked who would decide when intervention was justified and who would be accountable for mistakes. Earth answered by building mechanisms that shared authority and data, and by inviting oversight even from rivals. Trust grew not from claims, but from patterns repeated under scrutiny. Myra traveled with convoys into regions once written off as perpetual battlefields. She spoke with elders who had lost track of how many ceasefires had failed. They told her that the new approach felt strange because it did not pause for negotiation while killing. Continued, it acted first to stop harm and argued later about philosophy. Elias aged into a role that was less about coordination and more about mentorship. He taught younger planners to look for choke points that reduced suffering rather than maximized leverage. He reminded them that speed without care could become its own cruelty, and that restraint was a discipline, not a slogan. Across media, the phrase "Earth's answer to the carnage" became shorthand for an ethic that demanded clarity. People argued about its limits, but few missed the days when massacres were filed as compliant actions. The old language sounded hollow, once heard again. A summit on a neutral station marked a turning point.
Alligat.
Shared data showing long-term declines in displacement and famine correlated with early decisive interventions. The room was quieter than past gatherings, less performative, more practical agreements were signed about early warning and shared response. There were still wars. The universe remained vast and uneven. Yet when violence flared, it was more often met with collective action, aimed at stopping it rather than managing its appearance. The difference saved time and lives in ways that spreadsheets struggled to capture, but communities felt deeply. Rowan watched students graduate who had never known the